Hey everyone, I'm Adrienne Sanders, and I'm going to talk a little bit about reaching those with disabilities, both at a local level and through legislative. So, the Americans with Disabilities Act defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activity. This includes people who have a record of impairments, even if they currently do not have that disability. So this law makes it unlawful to discriminate against any person that has an association with a disability. It's important to remember that in the context of the ADA, disability is a legal term rather than a medical one. So the purpose of this law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. This law covers 5 sections: employment, public services, public accommodations, even at private entities, telecommunications, and then there's a miscellaneous section. A little bit about the disability in the United States. So according to the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, currently 1 in 4 adults in the U.S. have a disability, and this includes those with vision impairments, hearing, mobility, and cognition disabilities. This proportion only grows with age, with 40% of those with a disability over the age of 65. So the number would be around 61 million adults currently in the U.S. live with a disability. Also, in 2016, 77% of people in the U.S. without a disability were employed full-time, but only 36% of people with disabilities were employed. Kind of same for education. Only 16% of people with disabilities have completed a bachelor's degree versus 35% of people without disabilities. And the number of disabilities is expected to project and grow over the next few years or so. So by 2030, in the next decade, most baby boomers will be at least 65. And so with that age, the number of disabilities will increase. Starting at early intervention and education, this is the first place that most families see the need for intervention for their child with a disability and don't exactly know what's offered to them. So children with disabilities and their family continue to face significant barriers to accessing inclusive, high-quality early childhood programs. And a lot of these preschool children with disabilities are only offered the option of receiving special education services in settings separate from their peers who do not have disabilities. So these early intervention programs assist with reaching major milestones, but in order to participate, an evaluation must be done on these children to confirm eligibility. So these services are provided under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is IDEA, and these are done through grants given to each state from the federal government. So depending state to state, there are different rules for each state regarding eligibility. So if your state says your child is eligible for an early intervention service, then your family will get an IFSP, which is an individualized family service plan. So a team will work with you to develop this plan, and it will define goals and the types of services that your child will get. Some of these types of early intervention include physical, cognitive, communication, self-help, social or emotional assistance, and sensory processing. Some of these intervention services include screening and assessment, speech or physical therapy, home visits, hearing or vision services, social work services, or transportation. And under IDEA, a child is eligible until the age of 3, but it can be extended if needed after an additional assessment. After 3, the treatment can continue, but in the aspect of the school system and individualized education programs, so IEPs. So once a child is done with early intervention and education in those settings, then public institutions and other legislative comes into play. For example, Section 504 thus defines that qualified individuals with a physical or mental condition cannot be restricted by higher education resources. So that's those with neurological conditions, emotional or mental illness, learning disability, organ impairments, musculoskeletal impairments, and they say that under Section 504, the universities must offer assistive aids or services such as note-taking services, course substitutions, priority class registration, and accessible testing locations. So some of the limitations of this law is that some institutions, like private colleges, do not receive federal funding, so it makes them exempt from complying with Section 504. But even if they are exempt, there are other disability rights legislation that people can look into. Also, most of the IDEA regulations cover primary and secondary students between the ages of 3 to 21. However, transition services included in the Act are very relevant to future college applicants. So under IDEA, high schools are expected to provide students with certain services to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities. So they will have advising sessions and discuss goals. Also, public institutions are under the requirement of the Assistive Technology Act, which have grants that help fund the purchase of assistive technologies such as voice amplifiers, special software, computing hardware, and wheelchairs if needed for students. These laws and opportunities are really important since nationally only about 2/3 of students from ages 14 through 21 with disabilities graduate with a regular diploma, while most of the other remaining students drop out. So transitioning from school to the real world is very difficult for those with disabilities. Through the early 1970s, many students with disabilities were denied access to regular public schools and were forced into special schools. So that was known as institutionalization. By 1990s, institutionalization has kind of become a taboo word in special education, and people started focusing more on inclusion, so the integration of special needs students into mainstream classrooms as much as possible. This became the new standard. In order to do so, workforce development programs that help people from 18 to 21 became more relevant and are increasing in opportunity. So these programs teach soft skills such as, what does it mean to have a job? How do I keep a job? How do you deposit even a paycheck? And they also practice their work tasks in a retrofitted classrooms. So they'll set up the real life environment so that they can practice on the job task. So some of the services and resources for adults with disabilities after they transition to the real world are really important. So independent living, they have opportunities such as accessory dwelling units, ADUs. So these are kind of like an in-law apartment. So they're attached to a primary house and they have a separate living room, bathroom, kitchen, and things like that. There are also assisted living facilities. There are things that are similar to retirement communities. Subsidized housing and boarding homes are all available for those with disabilities. In the recreation world, accommodations can make all the difference in performing optimally, gaining health benefits, and having fun for people with disabilities. So some examples of this are adaptive grips on paintbrushes, vibrating amplification systems for musicians who are deaf, adjustable height hoops in wheelchairs for basketball players, and many others. Transportation, there is trains are required to have accessible train cars for people with disabilities, even though not all stations are accessible, I will have to say that. But airlines are also required to provide assistance with boarding, deplaning, and making connections to those with disabilities. There is also assistive technology, so mobility aids such as wheelchairs, walkers, canes, hearing aids, cognitive aids for computer or electrical assistive devices, and also closed captioning for people with hearing problems. That's an example of assistive technology. And then there are many independent organizations listed to the right of the screen that help people and adults specifically in the real world to become a part of the community. So Special Olympics with sports, Goodwill with financial coaching. There's Special Needs Alliance, which will help with finding laws and connecting you to attorneys and understanding the world of disability. And then the ARC, who have information and referral services to anything from family support to residential support. These are really good to know, and we also offer them at a local level. So it's important to raise community awareness and involvement because researchers have found that disability awareness programs in schools have led young children to gain empathy and have positive attitudes. So these social barriers are broken and allow for a better, wholesome approach to inclusion. And when we include people with disabilities and awareness increases, the sense of isolation in the disabled community will decrease. So by using these local resources like Family Helping Families, or the Office of Aging and Adult Services and the ARC of Louisiana, we can really raise a community awareness and reach those in the community with disabilities. Please use any of these references to continue looking into disability, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to my presentation today.